The keys in my hand still smelled like the diner. Coffee grounds and bacon grease worked so deep into the metal that I'd stopped noticing it years ago. I was locking up the delivery van outside St. Agnes Memorial that evening, dropping off a week's worth of donated soup for the hospital's family assistance pantry, when I heard something that didn't belong in a quiet parking lot after dark. A woman crying, low and exhausted, the kind of crying that's been held in so long it comes out ragged when it finally breaks free. I didn't know yet that the sound would lead me toward the fullest 3 months of my life. I only knew, standing there with my keys still in my hand, that I couldn't walk past it and pretend I hadn't heard. My name is Wyatt Doyle. I'm 31, and I run Doyle's Diner on Route 9 just outside Cedar Hollow, Ohio, the same diner my father ran before me and his father before him. It isn't glamorous work, flipping eggs before sunrise, keeping the coffee hot for truckers and regulars who've sat in the same booths for 20 years. But it's honest work, and it keeps a man's hands busy enough that he doesn't spend too much time thinking about the empty apartment above the diner where I've lived alone since my fiancée Claire called off our engagement 4 years ago, 3 weeks before the wedding, saying small towns and diner life weren't the future she'd pictured for herself. I don't blame her for wanting more. I just stopped believing, somewhere in those 4 years, that anyone would ever want what I actually had to offer. My father used to say a diner survives on 2 things: good coffee and people who remember your name back. He built Doyle's from a single counter and 4 stools in 1971, and by the time I took it over after he passed 6 years ago, it had grown into the kind of place where 3 generations of the same families still ordered the same booths out of habit. I kept the same recipes, the same chipped blue mugs, the same bell over the door that announced every customer whether they wanted announcing or not. It was steady work, honest work, and it had been enough to fill most of my days, if not most of my nights. I followed the sound of crying to a beat-up sedan parked in the far corner of the hospital lot, past the brighter lights near the entrance. A woman sat behind the wheel, forehead pressed against her hands, shoulders shaking. I knocked gently on the window, careful not to startle her. She jumped, wiping her face fast before rolling the window down an inch. "I'm sorry," she said, voice thick. "I didn't realize anyone was out here." "You okay?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious enough. "Fine," she said automatically, the way people say fine when they mean anything but. Then something in her seemed to give out all at once, and she added, quieter, "My daughter's been admitted. She's stable, they say, but they need to keep her a few more days for observation. I just found out my landlord back home rented my apartment out from under me while I've been staying here at her bedside. I have nowhere to go tonight, and I don't even have enough left on my card for another night at the extended stay motel." I looked past her at the back seat, where a small suitcase and a few grocery bags sat stacked, the modest sum total of a life packed in a hurry. "What's your daughter's name?" I asked. "Ruby," she said. "She's 7. I'm Meredith. Meredith Cole." "Wyatt Doyle," I said. "I run the diner just up the road. Got an apartment above it, more space than I use most nights, and a couch that's seen better days but keeps a person plenty warm." She looked at me the way strangers look at offers too good to trust. "I can't ask you to do that." "You're not asking," I said. "I'm offering. No charge, no expectations, just a roof while you sort out the rest." Meredith hesitated a long moment, glancing back toward the hospital entrance like she was weighing whether staying near Ruby's window mattered more than her own comfort. "I don't want to be far from her," she admitted. "Diner's 10 minutes away," I said. "You can be back here before visiting hours even open." She was quiet, studying my face for whatever reassurance she needed, and finally nodded. "Okay, just until Ruby's discharged. Then we'll figure out the rest." "Take whatever time you need," I said, and something about saying it out loud felt like the first honest promise I'd made in longer than I wanted to admit. That first night, I gave her the bedroom and took the couch myself, waving off her protests with more stubbornness than manners. She came down to the diner early the next morning before heading back to the hospital, insisting on paying for her coffee even though I told her the pot was free for anyone staying under my roof. She had a quiet steadiness about her that surprised me, given everything she was carrying, answering the server's questions about cream and sugar with a patience that made me wonder how long she'd been holding herself together like that, piece by careful piece. One morning that first week, Meredith stayed behind at the diner instead of driving straight to the hospital, saying Ruby's doctors wanted an hour alone with her for a routine echo. She sat at the counter while I worked the griddle, watching the rhythm of the morning rush with something like fascination. "You know every single person who's walked through that door by name," she said, sipping her coffee. "Small towns don't leave you much choice," I said. "Everybody knows everybody's order before they know their own kids' birthdays." She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "I used to live in a city big enough that I didn't know my own neighbor's name. There's something almost comforting about a place small enough to notice if you're missing." "Nobody's missing anything on my watch," I said, sliding a plate of eggs toward old Frank Delgado without looking. "That's sort of the whole job description." She watched me a long moment after that, like she was recalculating something about the kind of man standing across the counter from her. Over the following days, I found myself driving her to and from the hospital more often than strictly necessary, staying later at the diner just so I'd have an excuse to make her dinner when she finally got back each evening, exhausted and hollow-eyed from another long day at Ruby's bedside. She talked about her daughter in the careful, worn voice of a mother who'd been fighting for her longer than these last few days, mentioning a heart condition Ruby had been born with, one that required regular hospital stays whenever infection or fluid built up too fast for her small body to manage. She never once complained about the burden of it. She only ever spoke of Ruby with a fierce, exhausted kind of love that made something in my own chest ache in recognition. "You don't have to keep driving me back and forth," she said one evening, sitting at my kitchen table while I reheated a pot of soup. "I know I'm already taking up more of your time than I have any right to." "I like the company," I said, and meant it more than I'd expected to when the words left my mouth. She looked up at me, something careful and searching in her expression. "Most people run the other direction from complicated," she said. "Sick kid, no housing, an ex-husband who acts like a bank account instead of a father." That last part caught my attention, though I didn't push. "Sounds like you've had plenty of practice handling complicated on your own," I said instead. "More than I'd like," she admitted, and left it there for the night. I learned about Ruby's father, Dr. Marcus Cole, in pieces over the following 2 weeks, the way you learn anything from someone still deciding how much of the story to hand you at once. He was a cardiologist at a private practice 2 hours away in Columbus, remarried now to a woman from an old, moneyed family, the Whitlocks, whose name carried weight in every hospital boardroom and country club in the state. Marcus paid child support, technically, enough to satisfy a court order and nothing more, and treated every request for anything beyond the bare minimum as an imposition on his new, polished life. "He acts like loving Ruby costs him something he'd rather spend elsewhere," Meredith told me one night, staring into her coffee mug like it might offer better answers than she'd found so far. "Every time her heart flares up and I need help covering an extra week of hospital parking or gas money to get here, he treats it like I'm trying to extort him." "That's not fatherhood," I said. "That's a man protecting his comfort instead of his kid." She looked at me, something unguarded flickering behind her tired eyes. "You say things so plainly, like the truth doesn't scare you the way it scares most people." "Truth's usually simpler than the excuses people build around it," I said. Took me a while to learn that myself. Ruby was discharged 11 days after that first night in the parking lot, small and pale but grinning ear to ear the moment she saw the diner's neon sign glowing above the front window. She took to the place immediately, perching on the counter stool nearest the register, coloring on paper placemats while Meredith worked the register some afternoons to help cover their keep, insisting she wasn't going to freeload even temporarily. Ruby called me Mr. Wyatt the first week, then just Wyatt by the second, then by the third, something that made my chest tighten every time she said it without thinking twice. Uncle Wyatt, a title she'd apparently decided on her own without asking either of us first. Ruby settled into diner life with the easy confidence only children seem to manage after upheaval, treating every regular customer like a new friend to interview. She learned Frank Delgado had been a mail carrier for 30 years, and asked him detailed questions about every dog on his old route. She decided Dolores, our longtime waitress, made the best hot chocolate in Ohio, and said so loudly enough that Dolores started keeping a mug warmed specifically for her every afternoon after school. Within a month, Half the regulars asked after Ruby by name before they even placed their order, and I found myself looking forward to those questions more than I expected. One afternoon, while Meredith restocked napkin dispensers along the counter, Ruby tugged my sleeve and held up a drawing of the diner, 3 stick figures standing in front of it. One clearly meant to be her, one meant to be her mother, and one, unmistakably, meant to be me, holding a spatula the size of my own arm. "That's us," Ruby said matter-of-factly, like the arrangement had already been settled somewhere I hadn't been consulted. I knelt down to her eye level. "That's a good drawing," I said, throat tighter than I expected. "Mommy says we shouldn't get too comfortable," Ruby said, glancing toward her mother across the diner. "But I like it here." "Me too," I admitted, and meant every word of it. The first real snow of the season came early that year, catching the whole town off guard on a Tuesday afternoon. Ruby stood at the diner window, pressing both palms to the cold glass, watching flakes pile up along Route 9 like she'd never seen anything like it, even though Meredith mentioned she'd grown up 2 states further north. "It's different when you're not worried about driving anywhere in it," Meredith admitted, watching her daughter's delight. "For once, we don't have anywhere urgent to be." I closed the diner early that day, an unheard of decision for a Tuesday, and the 3 of us bundled up to build a lopsided snowman in the gravel lot out front, using 2 of my old aprons for arms and a chipped coffee mug for a hat. Ruby declared it the finest snowman in the history of Cedar Hollow, and Meredith laughed harder that afternoon than I'd heard her laugh in the 6 weeks since I'd first found her crying in that parking lot. Watching her, cheeks pink from the cold, I understood I'd stopped thinking of this arrangement as temporary a while back, whether either of us had said so out loud yet or not. Meredith found permanent work at the accounting firm in town within a month, steady enough hours that she and Ruby could have started looking for their own place. But somehow the conversation about moving out kept getting quietly postponed. First because Ruby had another checkup scheduled, then because winter was coming and the diner apartment was warmer than anything they could afford on their own just yet. I never pushed the timeline. I liked the sound of 2 extra sets of footsteps overhead too much to rush them toward the door. One evening in early November, after Ruby had gone to bed, Meredith and I sat on the back stairs of the diner, mugs of tea cooling between us while snow started drifting lazily past the porch light. "Can I ask you something?" I said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Depends on the question." "Marcus, does he know Ruby's staying somewhere new? Does he ever ask to see her?" Something in Meredith's expression closed, the way it always did around the subject of her ex-husband. "He visits twice a year, if that. Christmas, if his schedule allows it, and her birthday, usually late. Vanessa, his wife, doesn't care for Ruby coming to their house too often. Says it disrupts the routine of their own children." Her voice cracked slightly. "I stopped expecting more from him a long time ago. It's easier than being disappointed every single time." "That's not fair to Ruby," I said quietly. "No," Meredith agreed. "It isn't. But fair's a word rich families get to define however suits them, and I learned that lesson the hard way during our divorce." I felt something protective settle hard in my chest, sharper than I expected for a man who'd known this woman barely a month. "Nobody gets to treat that little girl like an inconvenience while she's under this roof," I said. Meredith looked at me, surprised by the steel in my voice. "You barely know either of us." "I know enough," I said. "I know Ruby drew a picture of the 3 of us standing in front of my diner like it's already home. I know you've worked yourself half to exhaustion trying to give her stability nobody else seems willing to help provide. That tells me plenty." Something in her face softened, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, the falling snow outside the only sound between us. One evening in late October, before Marcus ever showed up at the diner, Meredith and I stayed up long after Ruby had fallen asleep, going over the diner's books together at the kitchen table, since she'd offered to help organize my chaotic filing system in exchange for groceries. Somewhere between sorting receipts and laughing about my terrible handwriting, the conversation drifted somewhere quieter. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said, not looking up from the ledger. "Go ahead. Why didn't you ever remarry? Cedar Hollow's small, but it's not that small. Surely there were women interested." I set down the receipt I was holding. There was someone. Once. Claire, we were engaged. She left 3 weeks before the wedding, said small towns and diner life weren't the life she wanted. I paused. Took me a long while to stop believing she'd been right about that. That I wasn't offering anyone much worth staying for. Meredith looked up at me then, something unguarded in her expression. She was wrong, she said simply. Anyone who walked away from what you're offering wasn't looking clearly enough. Something in my chest tightened at the certainty in her voice. You don't know that yet, I said quietly, though I wanted badly to believe her. I think I'm starting to, she said. And neither of us said anything else for a long moment, the space between us thinner than either of us had let it get before. Then Ruby called out sleepily from upstairs, needing water, and the moment passed, though I carried the warmth of it with me long after Meredith went up to check on her daughter. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening, the diner was closed. A sleek black sedan pulled into the gravel lot out front. I recognized Marcus Cole immediately from a photo Meredith kept tucked in Ruby's old baby book, though the man in person carried himself with even more polish than the picture suggested. An expensive coat, a watch that cost more than my delivery van. The kind of easy confidence that comes from never once having to fight for anything. Meredith, he said, stepping out of the car like he expected the gravel itself to apologize for its texture under his shoes. I heard you'd moved into some diner owner's apartment. Living above a restaurant, Meredith? Really? This is what's best for our daughter? It's temporary, and it's warm, and it's none of your business. Meredith said, arms crossed tight. It's very much my business, Marcus said, voice smooth and rehearsed. Vanessa's parents have been asking questions about Ruby's living situation ahead of the custody review next month. It doesn't look responsible. Our daughter growing up above a diner with a man who isn't even family. I stepped forward, close enough that he finally acknowledged I existed. The apartment's warm, clean, and paid for by nobody but me, I said evenly. Sounds plenty responsible from where I'm standing. Marcus looked me over the way men like him always size up anyone they consider beneath their notice. And you are? The man who's been driving your daughter to cardiology appointments while you've been managing your comfortable schedule 2 hours away, I said. Where were you the week Ruby was hospitalized? Something flickered across his face, quick and defensive. I had patients depending on me. So did Ruby, I said. She just didn't have your number saved as an emergency contact anymore, did she? Marcus's jaw tightened, and for a second I saw past the polish to something colder underneath. He turned back to Meredith. We'll discuss the custody terms properly, through lawyers if necessary. The Whitlocks have significant influence with the family court in this county. This doesn't have to become difficult, Meredith, but it can if you insist on making it that way. He got back in his car and drove off, gravel spitting under the tires. Meredith stood frozen for a long moment, one hand pressed to her mouth. He's serious about the custody review, she said. If he convinces the court Ruby's living situation is unstable, he could push for more time, maybe full custody, and Ruby's cardiologist is here, Wyatt. Moving her away from her doctors could genuinely hurt her. Then we make sure the court sees exactly how stable this is, I said. Whatever that takes. A week after Marcus's visit, Vanessa's father made a call to the county's family services office, requesting an expedited review of Ruby's living arrangement ahead of schedule. Nothing came of it beyond a routine visit and a clean report, but the message was clear enough. These weren't people used to losing quietly. Meredith spent the following nights barely sleeping, convinced every knock at the diner door might be another lawyer's letter, waiting to unravel the fragile stability they'd built. The weeks that followed felt like watching a storm gather on the horizon, slow and certain. Marcus's lawyer sent a formal letter requesting a home evaluation. A caseworker visited the diner apartment, polite but thorough, asking about Ruby's routine, her school enrollment, whether she had her own space to sleep and study. I answered honestly. Meredith answered honestly. But every night after, I'd find her at the kitchen table with the letter spread in front of her, tracing the legal language like it might rearrange itself into something less frightening if she stared long enough. Maybe I should just agree to more of his terms, she said one night, voice hollow with exhaustion. Maybe if I don't fight the review, he'll ease off the rest. That's fear talking, I said. Not what's right for Ruby. How would you know? She snapped, then immediately looked stricken. I'm sorry. I'm just so tired of fighting people who have more money and more lawyers than I'll ever have. I sat down across from her, close enough that our knees nearly touched. You don't have to fight them alone, I said. I know you're used to carrying this by yourself, but you're not the only one standing here anymore. She looked up at me, disbelief and exhaustion warring on her face. Why do you keep saying things like that? I hadn't planned to answer honestly. Not yet. But the words came anyway, because somewhere in these last 2 months, you and that little girl upstairs stopped feeling like guests in my home, I said quietly. You started feeling like the reason I look forward to closing up the diner each night. Her breath caught. Neither of us moved for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking loud in the silence. Wyatt, she whispered, I can't lose her to people who think love is measured in country club memberships. You won't, I said, and this time I meant it as a promise, not comfort. The night before the hearing, I found Meredith at the kitchen table long after midnight, surrounded by every piece of paperwork she could gather. Ruby's cardiology records, her school's glowing progress report, a written statement from Dolores confirming just how settled and happy Ruby had become since arriving in Cedar Hollow. I sat down across from her and started sorting the pages into some kind of order, small stacks that made sense out of the chaos. You don't have to do this with me, she said, not looking up. I know, I said. I'm doing it anyway. She reached over and rested her hand on top of mine for a long moment, like she needed to confirm I was staying put. Neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. The custody review hearing was set for a cold Thursday morning in December at the county courthouse in Columbus. Meredith hadn't slept the night before, pacing the apartment long after Ruby had drifted off, needing something to do with her hands more than any actual task required. I drove her in before dawn. The roads still dark and icy, her fingers twisting together in her lap the whole way. Marcus was already there when we arrived, standing beside a sharp-suited lawyer and Vanessa, polished and silent, watching the proceedings like she found the whole affair distasteful, but necessary. Vanessa's father, a heavy-set man with a permanent frown, sat a row back, the kind of man used to getting exactly what his money paid for. Inside, the lawyer painted a picture of Ruby's living situation as unstable, temporary, dependent entirely on the charity of a diner owner Meredith had known barely 3 months. He questioned whether that was appropriate for a child with significant medical needs. I watched Meredith's hands shake under the table, watched her swallow every instinct to defend herself too loudly. Then it was her turn to speak, and something in her straightened, some old strength rising through the exhaustion. I lost my apartment while I was at my daughter's hospital bedside, through no fault of my own, she said, voice steady despite everything. I was offered a safe, warm home by a man who asked nothing in return. Ruby has not missed a single cardiology appointment since. She's enrolled in school here, thriving, and sleeping better than she has in months. I have built stability with what I had, even when the people who should have helped disappeared the moment things got difficult. Marcus's lawyer pressed her about my relationship to her, implying something opportunistic, something inappropriate for a man to offer so freely. That was when I stood, and the judge allowed me to speak. I offered Meredith a room because I heard a woman crying alone in a hospital parking lot with nowhere else to go, and I had an empty apartment doing nothing but collecting dust, I said. What's grown between us since then is real, and I won't apologize for it. But before anything grew, I watched a mother get told there was no room for her and her sick daughter in this town, and I decided that wasn't going to be true anymore. I'm not the reason Ruby needs protecting. I'm the reason she's had somewhere steady to heal. The judge studied the caseworker's report, Ruby's medical records, the school enrollment forms already filed for the new semester. She looked at Marcus's spotty visitation history, the 2 years between visits that predated Meredith even losing her apartment. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured and final. Meredith would retain primary custody, with the current living arrangement noted as stable and beneficial to Ruby's ongoing medical needs. Marcus would be granted his existing visitation schedule, subject to review only if his own involvement increased consistently over time. Meredith didn't cry until we were outside on the courthouse steps, and even then, they weren't only tears of relief. We drove back to Cedar Hollow in a silence that felt different from the tense one on the way there. Softer, lighter. Like something enormous had finally loosened its grip on her shoulders. When we pulled into the diner's gravel lot, snow had started falling again. Soft and steady. The same gentle kind that had been drifting the night we'd sat on the back stairs weeks earlier. Ruby was staying with the diner's longtime waitress, Dolores, for the day, worn out from the early morning drive she'd been spared. Meredith turned to me before we got out. "Wyatt, I don't know how to thank you for everything. The apartment, the courtroom, all of it." I looked at her, at the exhaustion and relief and quiet hope, all fighting for space on her face, and I knew there was only one thing left to say. The words that had been building in me since the night I first heard her crying in that parking lot. I reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to thank me," I said. "Just stay. Not because you have nowhere else to go anymore, but because I don't want to imagine my mornings without the sound of Ruby's feet on the stairs. Or yours." Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, but she was smiling through them. "You're sure? A ready-made family with a complicated ex and hospital bills isn't exactly simple. I stopped wanting simple the night I found you crying in that parking lot," I said. "I want you both. Every complicated, wonderful piece of it." She let out a small, shaking laugh, then leaned across the seat and kissed me. Soft and certain, like something that had been circling both of us for months had finally landed exactly where it belonged. "Okay," she whispered against my mouth. "We're staying." 8 months later, the apartment above Doyle's diner didn't feel like a temporary arrangement anymore. It felt like the only version of home either of us had ever fully believed in. Meredith had repainted the small kitchen a warm sage green, saying the space needed a color that felt permanent instead of borrowed. Ruby had her own room now, the old storage space converted with a real bed and shelves for her growing collection of drawings, most of which still ended up taped to the diner's walls behind the counter anyway. Dolores had taken to calling Ruby the diner's littlest regular, a title Ruby wore with tremendous pride. Ruby's drawings covered the refrigerator. The diner's regulars had long since adopted her as an honorary member of the breakfast crowd, sneaking her extra pancakes whenever Meredith wasn't looking. Marcus's visits had settled into something calmer, brief, but no longer weaponized. The court's clear terms leaving little room for the leverage he'd once tried to hold over us. Ruby's heart had stabilized enough over the following months that her cardiologist moved her checkups from monthly to quarterly, a small victory that felt enormous every time Meredith mentioned it. Marcus's visits had settled into something calmer, brief, but no longer weaponized. The court's clear terms leaving little room for the leverage he'd once tried to hold over us. He'd started sending a card for Ruby's report cards, small and awkward, but consistent in a way he'd never managed before the hearing forced his hand toward accountability. Some evenings, after closing, Meredith and I sat on the back stairs where we'd first admitted the truth to each other, Ruby's laughter drifting down from the open window above as she got ready for bed. I'd think back to that cold parking lot outside St. Agnes Memorial, the sound of crying I could have easily walked past, and how close I'd come to missing the fullest, most complicated, most worthwhile chapter of my entire life. Home isn't always the place you're born into. Sometimes it's the place you build with someone else's hand in yours, one ordinary evening at a time.